Birmingham, August 1940. In the darkness above the city, German bombers streak through the night sky with deadly precision. Below, air raid wardens watch in horror as incendiaries cascade down exactly onto vital munitions factories, railway yards, and aircraft production facilities. What should be impossible is happening before their eyes. These enemy crews are striking targets with an accuracy that daylight bombing had never achieved. For months, British intelligence has been baffled by the Luftwaffe's uncanny ability to find and devastate critical installations even in complete darkness. But on this very night, as fires bloom across Birmingham's industrial heart, a brilliant young physicist named Reginald Victor Jones pieces together the most chilling realization of his career. The Germans have deployed an invisible weapon more dangerous than any bomb, a revolutionary navigation system that can guide their bombers directly to any target in Britain, turning the cover of darkness from a shield into a hunting ground. For centuries, warfare had been bound by the limitations of human sight. When darkness fell, pilots became virtually blind, forced to navigate by the faint glimmer of stars and the vague shadows of landscapes far below. The very idea of precision bombing at night seemed as impossible as hitting a target with your eyes closed. Yet, Britain's industrial cities were being systematically dismantled with surgical precision under cover of complete darkness. British pilots knew this challenge intimately. Just months earlier, in May 1940, a Royal Air Force pilot named Captain Warren had set out on what should have been a routine mission to attack a German airfield in Holland. But a violent storm swept in. Clouds obscured every landmark, and Warren found himself flying blind through the murky night. When he finally spotted what he believed was his target and released his bombs, the explosions illuminated a horrifying truth. He had just bombed an RAF base in southern England. His fellow pilots would forever after call him Baron von Warren, a bitter reminder of how even experienced crews could become hopelessly lost in the darkness. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the terrifying norm. Navigation at night was so unreliable that bombing missions often turned into exercises in futility, with crews dropping their payloads on empty fields, friendly territory, or sometimes the wrong country entirely. The problem wasn't just about finding the right building. Pilots struggled to find the right city, the right country, sometimes even which direction was home. Without modern instruments, night navigation required celestial fixes, using the stars, dead reckoning calculations, and massive amounts of luck. RAF bombing accuracy studies from early 1940 revealed that even under ideal conditions, fewer than one bomb in 10 fell within 5 miles of its intended target during night operations. The circular error probability for night bombing often exceeded 8 kilometers, making precision attacks virtually impossible. These technical limitations plagued both sides equally. Early German night raids suffered from the same navigational chaos that crippled British operations. Luftwaffe crews would set out for London and find themselves over Liverpool or aim for Southampton and bomb empty countryside in Devon. HE-111 and Ju-88 crews reported the same frustrating experiences. Endless hours of flying in circles, searching for landmarks that looked nothing like their maps in the darkness, dropping bombs on cities they couldn't identify, and sometimes landing back at their bases with no idea where their weapons had fallen. But the Luftwaffe faced additional pressures that made solving the night navigation problem critical to German strategy. Unlike Britain, which could launch daylight raids across the English Channel with fighter escort, German bombers attacking Britain had to cross hundreds of miles of hostile airspace. Daylight operations invited interception by RAF fighters, which had proven devastatingly effective during the Battle of Britain. If Germany was to continue its bombing campaign against British industry and morale, it had to master the art of night attack. The alternative was to abandon the aerial offensive entirely, ceding control of the skies to the Royal Air Force. British scientific intelligence had been tracking disturbing reports since the spring of 1940. German bombing accuracy at night wasn't just improving. It was achieving levels that defied explanation. Factories located deep in the British heartland, far from any recognizable landmark, were being hit with devastating precision. Railway junctions in obscure industrial towns were being severed with surgical cuts. Most unnerving of all, the Germans seemed capable of returning to the exact same targets night after night, their bombing patterns forming neat geometric shapes that suggested a level of navigational control that should have been impossible. The first reports came from RAF intelligence officers analyzing bomb damage patterns. Instead of the random scatter that characterized most night bombing, German attacks were displaying an ominous consistency. Bombs were falling in precise lines, targeting specific buildings within large industrial complexes, and showing a level of accuracy that even daylight operations rarely achieved. One analysis of raids on Birmingham showed German bombers consistently hitting the Birmingham Small Arms Factory while avoiding nearby residential areas, a degree of selectivity that suggested intimate knowledge of target layouts combined with unprecedented navigational precision. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source: German prisoners of war who couldn't resist boasting about their secret weapons. In June 1940, British intelligence intercepted a conversation between captured Luftwaffe airmen in which one pilot bragged that the British would never discover their beam system, even though it was under their very noses. This casual arrogance would prove to be a fatal mistake. The conversation was immediately passed to Professor Reginald V. Jones, a 28-year-old physicist who served as the Assistant Director of Scientific Intelligence. Jones, the son of a postman who had earned his doctorate from Oxford by age 22, possessed exactly the right combination of technical brilliance and investigative instinct needed to unravel Germany's most closely guarded secret. Working with fragments of intelligence gathered from shot-down aircraft, intercepted radio transmissions, and the boastful conversations of captured airmen, Jones began to construct a terrifying picture. The Germans hadn't just solved the problem of night navigation, they had weaponized it. Using a revolutionary system of intersecting radio beams transmitted from stations across occupied Europe, German bombers could follow invisible highways in the sky that led directly to their targets. The pilots simply listened to radio signals on their headphones, adjusting their course until they heard a steady tone that indicated they were flying exactly down the center of the beam. When a second beam intersected the first directly over the target, automatic equipment would release their bombs with mechanical precision. The British codenamed this system Knickebein, meaning crooked leg, but its implications were anything but simple. For the first time in history, bombers could strike with the accuracy of artillery while flying hundreds of miles from their base. The system operated on medium frequencies around 30 megahertz, using the same basic principles as the Lorenz blind landing system that civilian aircraft used to land in fog. But the Germans had weaponized this peaceful technology, building massive transmitter arrays that could project narrow beams across hundreds of miles with deadly accuracy. The Knickebein system represented a masterpiece of German engineering ingenuity. Two powerful radio transmitters, often located hundreds of miles apart on the European continent, would broadcast carefully calibrated directional signals. The main beam, transmitted from stations in occupied France, would point directly toward the target in Britain. A second transmitter, typically positioned in Norway or Holland, would send its beam to intersect the first at precisely the point where bombs should be dropped. German pilots needed only to follow the main beam using standard aircraft radio equipment, listening for the steady tone that indicated they were flying down the center of the signal. When they heard the intersecting beam, they knew they were directly over their target. What made the system truly revolutionary was its simplicity and reliability. Unlike complex navigation systems that required specialized training, Knickebein could be operated by any pilot familiar with basic radio procedures. The beams were strong enough to be received clearly at ranges exceeding 200 miles, and their accuracy was sufficient to guide bombers to within a few hundred yards of their intended targets. For the first time in aviation history, night bombing had become as precise as daylight attacks. Jones quickly realized that Knickebein was just the beginning. German engineers were already developing even more sophisticated systems. The X-Gerät, or X apparatus, represented a quantum leap in bombing precision. Instead of relying on manual timing, this system used a series of automatically triggered radio beams named after German rivers: Weser, Rhine, Oder, and Elbe. As German bombers flew along the main Weser beam toward their target, they would encounter the narrower crossbeams in sequence. The Rhine beam, located 50 kilometers from the target, served as an early warning. The Oder beam, 20 kilometers out, started an automatic timing mechanism. Finally, the Elbe beam, just 5 kilometers from the target, triggered the bomb release with mechanical precision. This system could place bombs within 100 yards of a designated point, an accuracy that even daylight bombing rarely achieved. The X-Gerät system was reserved for specially trained Pathfinder crews flying modified HE-111 bombers. These aircraft carried sophisticated radio receiving equipment and automatic bombing computers that eliminated human error from the attack process. Once the bomber entered the Weser beam and began flying toward its target, the entire bombing run became mechanized. The pilot needed only to keep his aircraft centered in the beam, while the specialized equipment calculated wind drift, ground speed, and precise timing for bomb release. The result was bombing accuracy that approached that of modern guided weapons. British scientists were stunned by the implications. If the Germans could bomb with such precision in complete darkness, no British city would be safe. Factories, ports, airfields, and government buildings could all be systematically destroyed, while British night fighters groped helplessly in the darkness above. The economic and psychological impact would be devastating. Britain's war production could be crippled, and civilian morale would shatter under the weight of nightly precision attacks against which there seemed to be no defense. The strategic ramifications extended far beyond immediate military concerns. British war production depended on a network of specialized factories scattered across the industrial Midlands and North. Unlike Germany, which had concentrated much of its manufacturing in heavily defended areas, Britain's industrial capacity was distributed among dozens of cities and towns that had never been designed to withstand concentrated attack. If German bombers could strike these targets with pinpoint accuracy, they could systematically dismantle Britain's ability to produce aircraft, weapons, and ammunition without having to overcome the country's air defenses through sheer numbers. Jones knew that understanding the German system was only half the battle. Britain needed effective countermeasures, and they needed them immediately. Working with Wing Commander Edward Addison and the newly formed No. 80 Wing RAF, British scientists began developing electronic warfare techniques that would later revolutionize military technology. Their first attempts were desperate improvisations. Hospital medical equipment was requisitioned and modified to jam German radio signals. The early jammers were crude devices that simply broadcast noise across the German frequencies, hoping to drown out the navigation signals. The initial British response was characterized by desperate improvisation and brilliant innovation in equal measure. Medical diathermy equipment was stripped from hospitals and converted into radio jammers. Television transmitters from the BBC were modified to broadcast interfering signals. Even amateur radio operators were recruited to help jam German frequencies using their personal equipment. These early efforts were coordinated from a secret facility at Beacon Hill, where a team of scientists and engineers worked around the clock to understand and counter the German beam systems. But Jones and his team quickly realized that crude jamming wasn't enough. The Germans would simply increase their transmission power or change frequencies. Instead, the British developed a far more sophisticated approach called meakening. Using a network of false radio beacons spread across Britain, they could capture German navigation signals, modify them slightly, and retransmit them with more power than the original German stations. German pilots would unknowingly follow these false signals, believing they were on course while actually flying miles away from their intended targets. The meakening system represented a breakthrough in electronic deception. Rather than simply blocking German signals, British operators could manipulate them, introducing subtle course corrections that would gradually lead bombers away from their targets. The beauty of this approach was its invisibility. German pilots had no way of knowing their navigation beams had been compromised. From their perspective, they were following standard procedures and receiving clear signals, but the beams themselves had been twisted into new paths by British interference. The psychological warfare aspect was crucial. Rather than simply blocking German signals, which would immediately alert the enemy that their system was compromised, the British wanted to make the Germans question the reliability of their own technology. By introducing subtle errors and gradually increasing the deviation from intended flight paths, British scientists hoped to create the impression that the navigation beams were naturally unreliable rather than being actively jammed. The technical challenge was immense. British engineers had to build receiving stations capable of detecting the German beam signals, processing equipment to modify them in real time, and powerful transmitters to broadcast the false signals. All of this had to be accomplished in a matter of weeks, while German bombers continued to devastate British cities nightly. The work was carried out in absolute secrecy, with engineers often unaware of the ultimate purpose of the equipment they were building. Construction of the countermeasures network proceeded at breakneck speed across Britain. Secret installations were established from Scotland to Cornwall, each equipped with sensitive radio receivers, powerful transmitters, and the newly developed beam-bending equipment. The sites were disguised as agricultural buildings or industrial facilities to avoid detection by German reconnaissance aircraft. Communication between stations was maintained through buried telephone cables and encrypted radio links that allowed coordinated responses to German bombing raids. The first successful test of British countermeasures came during a German raid on Birmingham in November 1940. As Luftwaffe bombers approached the city following their radio beams, British operators began transmitting false signals. The results were immediately apparent. Instead of striking the industrial center with their usual precision, German bombs scattered across empty countryside miles from their intended targets. Pilots reported navigation difficulties, and German bombing accuracy began a precipitous decline. The effectiveness of British countermeasures was demonstrated dramatically during subsequent raids. Luftwaffe formations that had previously struck their targets with surgical precision suddenly found themselves dropping bombs on farms, forests, and empty fields. German pilots report impossible phenomena: radio beams that seemed to bend in midair, navigation equipment that led them in circles, and automatic bombing systems that released their payloads over the ocean. The psychological impact on German aircrew was as significant as the tactical success of the jamming operations. Encouraged by this success, British scientists expanded their countermeasures. They developed increasingly sophisticated jamming techniques, learned to predict German targeting based on beam alignments, and even began feeding false information back to German ground controllers. The Battle of the Beams, as it came to be known, had begun in earnest. It was fought not with guns and bombs, but with radio waves and electronic signals, a preview of the high-tech warfare that would dominate conflicts for decades to come. The escalation of electronic warfare techniques proceeded rapidly on both sides. British operators learned to manipulate German beam systems in real time, introducing course corrections that would lead bomber formations away from their targets while maintaining the illusion of normal operation. German engineers responded by increasing transmission power, changing frequencies, and developing new encoding systems to prevent British interference. Each innovation was quickly countered by the opposing side, creating an arms race in electronic warfare technology. The Germans responded by developing more advanced systems. The Weigerat, also known as Wotan after the one-eyed Norse god, attempted to overcome British countermeasures by using a single, extremely narrow beam transmitted from a ground station. German aircraft would interrogate this beam using onboard equipment, measuring their distance from the transmitter with unprecedented accuracy. But British intelligence had anticipated this development. Even before the first Weigerat system became operational, British scientists had deployed countermeasures that rendered it useless. The Weigerat system represented the pinnacle of German radio navigation technology. Unlike previous systems that relied on intersecting beams, Weigerat used a sophisticated transponder system that allowed ground controllers to track individual aircraft with pinpoint accuracy. German bombers equipped with Weigerat could be guided to their targets by ground operators who monitored their progress in real time, making course corrections and timing bomb releases from hundreds of miles away. The system was so advanced that it foreshadowed modern satellite navigation and precision-guided weapons. By late 1940, the electronic war had reached a stalemate. Every German innovation was quickly countered by British defensive measures. The Luftwaffe's bombing accuracy had returned to pre-beam levels, and the threat of precision night attacks had been largely neutralized. German bomber crews, frustrated by their navigation difficulties, began to lose confidence in their equipment. Reports filtered back to German commanders describing impossible phenomena: radio beams that seemed to bend in midair, navigation signals that led aircraft in circles, and automatic bombing equipment that released payloads over empty ocean. The impact on German bomber operations was devastating. Experienced aircrew who had previously conducted precision attacks with confidence now reported navigation systems that seemed to malfunction without explanation. Training programs for new pilots became increasingly difficult as instructors found themselves unable to explain why proven navigation techniques were producing unreliable results. Morale among bomber squadrons began to deteriorate as missions that should have been routine became exercises in frustration and confusion. German military leadership struggled to understand why their once reliable navigation systems had suddenly become unreliable. Technical experts examined equipment for mechanical failures, investigated the possibility of atmospheric interference, and even theorized that British scientists had discovered a way to bend radio waves. The true cause of their difficulties, systematic electronic warfare by British countermeasures, remained hidden behind layers of deception and misdirection that convinced German engineers their own technology was flawed rather than being actively sabotaged. The human cost of this invisible war was measured not in the dramatic explosions of conventional combat, but in the attacks that never happened. British cities that would have been devastated by precision bombing campaigns remained intact. Factories continued production. Civilian morale held firm. The economic foundation of Britain's war effort survived the darkest period of the conflict, largely because a handful of scientists and engineers had successfully fought off an attack by invisible weapons. The strategic implications extended far beyond Britain's immediate survival. The electronic warfare techniques developed during the Battle of the Beams would later be used to protect Allied bombers over occupied Europe, defend naval convoys against German submarines, and support the D-Day landings. The organizational structures created to fight this invisible war, specialized intelligence units, rapid technology development programs, and close cooperation between scientists and military personnel would become templates for the military-industrial complex that emerged after the war. By early 1941, the effectiveness of British countermeasures had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of air warfare over Europe. German bombing accuracy against British targets had declined to levels comparable to the chaotic early months of the war, while British night bombing operations over Germany began to benefit from improved navigation aids and electronic warfare techniques. The technological advantage that had briefly given the Luftwaffe the ability to conduct precision night attacks had been neutralized through scientific innovation and electronic deception. Perhaps most importantly, the Battle of the Beams demonstrated that technological superiority could be temporary and fragile. The Germans had achieved what seemed impossible, perfect navigation in complete darkness, only to see their advantage neutralized by enemy countermeasures within months. This lesson would resonate throughout the war and beyond, driving both sides to accelerate their research and development programs in an endless race for technological supremacy. The immediate tactical impact of British success in electronic warfare became apparent during the devastating raid on Coventry in November 1940. Despite German claims that the attack demonstrated the effectiveness of their navigation systems, post-war analysis revealed that British countermeasures had significantly reduced the raid's precision. While the city center was heavily damaged, many of the specific military and industrial targets that the Germans had intended to destroy remained operational. The raid's psychological impact far exceeded its strategic value, largely because German bombers had been unable to achieve the pinpoint accuracy their navigation systems should have provided. As 1941 dawned, the immediate threat had passed. German bombing accuracy remained poor. British cities continued to function, and the Luftwaffe's attention was already turning eastward toward the coming invasion of the Soviet Union. The radio navigation systems that had once seemed so promising were quietly abandoned, their massive transmitter arrays left to rust along the French coast. In the long annals of military history, the Battle of the Beams would occupy only a footnote, a brief period of technological warfare between more dramatic campaigns of tanks and infantry. For the scientists and engineers who fought this invisible war, the victory represented something far more significant. They had proven that scientific intelligence could be as decisive as military force, that electronic warfare could neutralize even the most advanced weapon systems, and that the minds of researchers and technicians could be as crucial to victory as the courage of soldiers and airmen. The dark skies over Britain, once highways for German bombers guided by invisible beams, had become a battlefield where science itself determined the outcome of war. The legacy of this hidden conflict would outlast the war itself. Electronic warfare, born in the desperate struggle against German navigation beams, would evolve into one of the dominant forms of military technology. Radar jamming, signal intelligence, and electronic countermeasures would shape every major conflict of the 20th century. The techniques pioneered by Jones and his colleagues would protect Allied forces in conflicts from Korea to the Persian Gulf, their invisible shields as vital to modern warfare as armor plating and defensive fortifications. Today, as military forces around the world rely on GPS navigation, satellite communications, and computer-controlled weapon systems, the lessons of the Battle of the Beams remain more relevant than ever. The side that controls the electromagnetic spectrum often controls the battlefield. The ability to jam enemy signals, protect friendly communications, and maintain technological superiority in the invisible realm of electronic warfare has become as crucial as traditional military might. In an age when battles can be won or lost by hackers attacking computer networks half a world away, the young physicist who first detected German radio beams over Britain appears remarkably prescient. The Luftwaffe's darkest weapon had indeed brought Britain to its knees, but only briefly. Through scientific ingenuity, technological innovation, and sheer determination, British researchers had turned the tide of an invisible war that most of the world never knew was being fought. In the end, the beams that were meant to guide German bombers to victory became symbols of a different kind of triumph, the victory of human intelligence over seemingly insurmountable technological challenges, and the proof that even in the darkest hours of war, knowledge and creativity could overcome the most formidable weapons.